But thank you. So like you said, I'm Kevin Braafladt. I'm the Army Sustainment Command historian. And so like I mentioned to you previously that, we're looking at celebrating the 160th anniversary of Rockhound Arsenal. And the series kind of goes from the early foundings of, federal presence here in the area to today, and the establishment of the arsenal over the years. So, this first talk, we're really fortunate to live in an area that has had the furthest west War of 1812 battle that had taken place, and in the Army we give what was called or what is called staff rides, where the leaders' professional development, taking soldiers and civilians out to the actual battlefields and walking them around, teaching them about the battle, and actually walking on the battlefield itself to show, studying it was one thing, reading about it is one thing, but actually walking in the footsteps of the people you've read about, it shows you different perspectives on these things. So you have the opportunity here to actually walk to these locations or go to these locations and walk the battlefield. So it's kind of an interesting aspect. But we'll be discussing the battles of Campbell's and Credit Island, as well as a little bit of the background for it. We also know or call these battles the Battle of the Rockhound Raptors. So, and I'll explain a little bit more about that here. Oh, there you go. Okay. So, starting off, following the American Revolutionary War, the United States was growing slowly, further west, and there was always this sense of manifest destiny that we would grow basically as far as the United States could to the west coast or to the Pacific Ocean. And in 1803, it took a significant step. So the United States government bought the equivalent of about 820,000 square miles, or roughly 15 states, present-day states, of land from the French government while they were involved in the Napoleonic Wars between France and Britain. And we bought it for, at the time, $15 million, or like it says here, with inflation equivalent to about $368 million. So it's a pretty good bargain for purchasing 15 states. But the thing about this was that while France had some done some mapping of the area, it was largely unexplored, and we didn't know what we really purchased here. This is one of those sight unseen home buys here. So as soon as we bought it, President Jefferson, Thomas Jefferson, wanted to send out explorers to find out what we bought, what we actually owned here now. And the other problem with it was that there were actually people living. Native Americans were spread across, obviously, through this whole area. And so we wanted to make connections with them and try to form some bonds that the French government and some of the British government had already formed to establish the United States presence here. And so the most famous part of this, and I didn't mention it, the Louisiana Purchase took place in 1803, but the most famous expedition was the Lewis and Clark expedition, which heads up through the northern part of this purchase out to the west coast to find the Pacific Ocean, or find a way to the Pacific Ocean, I should say. But one of the lesser known expeditions was under the command of Zebulon Pike, and his expedition went up the Mississippi River to roughly find the headwaters of the Mississippi, and have a general idea of mapping it in itself. And so you see us here in Iowa, and he runs across this island in the middle of the Mississippi River, and identifies it at a really strategic point. It was the only point in the river's history that flows east to west. And we look at the river now with the lock and dam here, but at the time, obviously, the river was about 10 to 15 feet lower, depending on water level. And so the island, known as Rockhound today, was like this own fortress. It had 10-foot walls that stuck up out of the river. All the water, or all the river portion north of that of the island was known as the Rockhound Rapids, or it would become known as Rockhound Rapids, and was one of the most treacherous points of the Mississippi River. And so he actually notices the strategic importance of this island, saying, well, if you put a port here on this island, you can control river traffic and control trade in the area. And so he notes it in his papers, And unfortunately, nothing really much happened after that for a while. But in 1804, the next thing that really impacts this area was the negotiation of the Sauk and the Fox Treaty. And so what you see here is an overall map of present-day Illinois, and the red section there that's highlighted is the section of this treaty. And so basically, this was a land ceding to the United States from the Sauk and the Fox. The problem that happened here was, and I'll admit that our negotiations with the Native Americans at the time and treaties obviously wasn't always as fair as it should have been to them. And there was an incident that had taken place where a Native American had been accused of murder. He was being held in St. Louis, and 3 of the tribal elders came down to St. Louis to get him out of jail and bring him back. Well, during that time, some government representatives contacted them and said, hey, we want to negotiate this treaty for this whole section of land here, and ended up getting them drunk and negotiating for them to sign the treaty, basically ceding all this land to the federal government. Now the thing was that they could remain on the land until settlers came in to take the land eventually. They were compensated, obviously not by very much here, but you can see the vast amount of land here. The problem is that we didn't really understand what it took to negotiate with some of these tribes. And with the Sauk Nation, that you didn't just make a deal with, there wasn't one ruler, one chief. There was a series of chiefs. And what we didn't understand was that you had to negotiate and have all of the chiefs within this tribe agree to a set condition like this. And so the Sauk Nation never really fully saw this as a valid or legal, in their eyes, treaty. And so they kind of went on living their lives like that. One of the individuals that would rise to being most vocal or outspoken against this treaty was Chief Blackhawk. And he was basically a tribal war chief here. And he felt that his father was basically one of the head chiefs or one of the lead chiefs of the Sauk Nation. And so he was kind of, high up in the organization itself. This is where his father was buried. And he said that, land can't just be given like that. That it's not for somebody to own necessarily. This is the land where the Sauk Nation lives and where their existence is. And so they never really saw it as a valid treaty. And obviously had discontent over it. Well, the next thing that really brings us back up is the War of 1812 starts. And the discussion as to the validity of this treaty came under the scrutiny again, where the Native Americans started looking at, well, hey, maybe if the British win this war, we'll have all of our land back. The treaty will be null and void and no big deal. And the British were very good throughout most of their history in negotiating and working with Native American tribes, giving them tributes and giving them medals. And this is one of the things that Native Americans talked a lot about, was that they would have medals of either the Indian relations representative in the British government or the king at the time, and they would actually wear the medal around their neck as kind of a sign of pride, saying, "Hey, we are aligned with the British," in this sense, and they give us presents. They support us in a sense, and so their influence was pressing way down into the area that the Louisiana Purchase would be, and so this is one of the things that would come to forefront as we start the War of 1812 here. Now, one of the things, the War of 1812 is always kind of one of these forgotten wars in American history. If we're taught about it in school, it's one of these things where, we know the White House got burned down and, the British eventually left. Well, if you look at it and you look at like a sampling of the newspapers over the war, before the war starts, we were really upset that the British were impressing our sailors. And what that meant was that with the British fighting the French in the Napoleonic War, they were so short of sailors in the Royal Navy that they could actually, if they felt a ship that was, giving supplies to France or giving supplies to somebody that they were fighting against, they'd actually take sailors off of the enemy ship that they captured and put them in their own navy. And so they were actually taking individuals off the ships and putting them in their own navy, impressing sailors into their own service. This is something obviously we were very upset at. There were also some issues with ownership over Canada, and how that was going to work, and just lingering discontent between the United States and Britain, since the American Revolutionary War had not taken place that long. But in studying newspapers, it's really kind of funny to see this ride this wave. Up front it was, yeah, we can get the British back. We can show them who's boss the second time. Win our second Revolutionary War. They're impressing our sailors. This can't happen. We're our own valid nation. And then as the war starts, it's like, yeah, you kind of have this war fear, like, yeah, we can do it. It's a real war now, and things are starting to get hard. And then France leads the war in the Napoleonic Wars, and so Britain can shift all of their attention to the United States now. And then see the newspapers like, this wasn't such a great idea, to start this war. This might not turn out so well for us. And then it turned into, yeah, we might actually become a British colony again. This sucks. This is not going well for us. And at the very end, it was kind of like, well, we'll just amicably choose to disagree with each. And, nobody was truly a real winner. Britain was so tired of war, was so heavily in debt, that we just decided to go our own separate ways, right? And call it a draw, And one of our, our biggest victories actually happened after the official war had come to an end. We just didn't know it had come to an end, or had been officially signed, with Jackson down in Louisiana, obviously. So the War of 1812 was really, kind of this roller coaster of emotions for the United States. And where this is relevant is all the way out here for us in the far west of the frontier. One of the biggest pieces that was most relevant to us was control of the Great Lakes. Is it, if you're going from Chicago to let's say New York, it would take you a long time to go over by land. Well, the main and fastest route was either go up the Mississippi River, or going by water, or going through the Great Lakes. And this was the fastest and most efficient way to get things moving from either side of the country at the time. And so you see a lot of the battles taking place up there. It was a really hotly contested area. And this is just kind of a more zoomed in map showing the different forts on both the United States and the British side. But you see this little city or village way out west out here called Prairie du Chien. And why this is relevant is that Prairie du Chien sits at the convergence of the Wisconsin River and the Mississippi River. And for the United States, this was an important way that if we could get a hold of Prairie du Chien, this was our waterway connection from the Mississippi River into the Great Lakes. And we could potentially ship supplies, have supplies come to St. Louis, from Chicago or any the other cities in the Great Lakes. But we could also push influence out into the fighting that was taking place up there to control the waterways. And there was threat of attack against St. Louis. And the district commander or area commander, or governor, I should say, was Governor William Clark of Lewis Clark fame. He was the governor of Missouri at this time, or Missouri Territory, I should say. And so he wanted to push influence away and threats from St. Louis. And one of his main goals, or one of his main thoughts, was to establish a fort at Prairie du Chien to pull that attention away and then control that waterway connection as well. So that was our connection with the War of 1812 and the battles that we're going to talk about here. And the battles of Credit and Campbell's Island were the furthest western fought battles in the War of 1812. And it caused basically us to abandon the whole upper Mississippi River Valley region because of them. So to take a step back and kind of put some of this into context for you, that what it was like on the ground. So these are the typical muskets that you might find being used by both the British, the American forces, and the Native American forces here. Native Americans actually were really very well armed at this time in this area. So the top one is 1795 Springfield musket. This is one of the very first production weapons the United States had built, 69 caliber. And if you look at the typical human thumb, it's about 58, 60 caliber. So imagine 69 caliber round lead ball that's being loaded down that barrel. And these are flintlocks. And so what that means is that in order to load it, you have a paper cartridge that you pour the powder down the barrel, you put your round ball down the barrel, and then you pour a little bit of powder into a pan at the back of the musket. and there's a steel cover to that pan, and there's a piece of flint that strikes the steel, makes sparks, puts sparks down into the powder in the pan, which ignites the main powder charge in the musket and shoots the musket. So I know that sounds confusing. There's a lot of steps there. Well, it was. And there's a lot of places where that can go wrong. So because you have raw or loose black powder, it's really susceptible to things like moisture, like rain, or even fog. You know, like if you have a heavy fog, that the powder in your pan may get wet and not go off, or you may have powder in your pan go off and the musket doesn't go off. Hence, a flash in the pan. You know that your gun doesn't shoot, but your powder in the pan goes off. And so, or you know, there's a lot of sayings that come out of this period, like keep your powder dry. Well, you don't want your powder to get wet because your gun doesn't work. And so, a trained soldier with a clean weapon can fire somewhere between 2 and 3 rounds per minute, doing all those steps, ramming the bullet down and all that. And then when all else fails, you have your bayonet, which is basically the knife or the long pokey thing on the end of your gun. Now the British and the British weapons are about the same in how they load. The British brown vest is actually 72 caliber, so it's just a little bit bigger. Now, one of the things I like to point out with this too is that they're muskets. There's no rifling in the barrel. It's just basically you imagine a ball that's bouncing down a clean or smooth pipe. So these muskets were only accurate from about 50 to 60 yards. So imagine a football field, only about halfway across the battlefield or a football field. Can you ever hope to hit something somewhat accurately at that distance? Now you can hit something further out, but it may not be what you're shooting at. You know, you might hit the island or something that you're shooting at, but not a person. And so that's kind of the conditions that you're looking at in these. And going and talking about these battles. So you know, soldiers are worried about obviously they're keeping the powder dry. They're worried about can we hit something. And you know, on the East Coast battles, that's why you see hundreds, if not thousands, of soldiers lining up and firing at each other because they're both turning into basically a giant shotgun. If you get 1,000 guys, some of their rounds will impact some of the guys on the other side. But out here in the West, you actually see more guerrilla type battles. You know, they're not so much lined up troops marching at each other. It's more unconventional battles in that sense. So that's just one of the conditions that we have here. Now, this is actually, they're artist concepts or drawings of what soldiers were looking like at this time, or what the forces we're going to be talking about here look like. This is actually, I think, a depiction of Blackhawk here. And you can see actually the medallion that he's wearing around his neck. That's one of those medals that I was talking about. That would be the Indian representative that contacted him is giving him the medal, and he's giving him black powder or whatever they're looking for at the time. And so that that's your typical Native American dress at that time. But you also see Native American warriors, wearing more traditional Western uniforms or unconventional uniforms. But the 3 organizations or 3 groups we're looking at are Americans, and amongst them, you'll have militia or volunteers. So these are irregular soldiers. You're talking about, for militia, bringing a bunch of farmers together that happen to have a musket or something, coming together and saying, hey, we're going to say, we need you for 60 or 80 days or something like that to take you somewhere to help out. And typically the militia are the first ones to run away when things get hard. Rangers are kind of in between. These are contract soldiers that are being paid for a set period of time, and they're typically more experienced. They might have been in a battle, but they're probably trappers or fur traders or things like that. They know their way around the backcountry, and they know how to use their equipment. And then you have regulars. So these are soldiers that or individuals that have joined the Army for long-term enlistments, and typically have some kind of training. They're typically wearing more of an established uniform, except out here in the West, you're going to see still a little bit more regular uniform because it's what's more practical. And then on the British side, the British soldier in the red coat, like you see in the Revolutionary War, you're probably not going to see a whole lot of that out here. In the battle that we'll talk about, there was only one really regular British soldier that was involved. And then you'll have French Canadian militia, and then Native Americans that are adding into that. So these are kind of setting some of the conditions of the soldiers or individuals that will be engaged in this. So now I know this map looks funny, all the writing's upside down. The cartographer drew it so that north was to the bottom of the map. So we just flipped it around. But this is Rock Island, or Arsenal Island, I'm sorry. And then Campbell's Island and Credit Island here. Obviously Davenport, where we are, is to the north, Rock Island, and then the Lanes to the south. The yellow circle there is actually the village of Sakanak. And this is where the traditional head of the Sauk nation is. Now, it's really unusual where most Native American tribes were, maybe only a few hundred in a set camp. The Sakanak was somewhere between 12 and 15,000 Native Americans. And this could, have a culmination of Fox, Winnebago, and kind of a mismatch of a bunch of different tribes. They're all choosing to live in one locality. And there's a great place just to the south of us, Blackhawk State Park, that has a lot of displays. They talk about the village of Sakanak, some of the archaeological evidence that they have down there. I recommend you heading down there and take a look at it sometime. They have a lot of information about the Sauk and the Native Americans in the area. So, like I said, Campbell's Island to the east, which we'll be talking about here in a second, and then Credit Island to the west. So, when the War of 1812 starts, the Sauk and the Fox were really split about, hey, should we support the United States or should we support, United Kingdom? We are Britain, and you have advocates like Blackhawk who are saying that, hey, well, if we go with the British, we can get all of our land back. All these treaties with the Americans are all going to be null and void. The British have made all these promises and saying, hey, we'll leave you alone. You can do whatever you want. We'll continue giving you presents. You can wear our medals and things like that. And so you have these advocates, but then you have a lot of tribal chiefs in both the Sauk and the Fox tribes who are saying, hey, this is not our war. We need to stay in the middle, stay out of it, let them fight their war and leave us out of it. And that's probably a majority of the tribes. They just wanted to be left alone and not get messed up into what was going on here. Blackhawk, which I'll mention a little bit later, but he would continue this fight on following the War of 1812 here, the conclusion of the war. And like I said before, the British are increasingly giving more presence and agitating the Native Americans to push further south and attack American settlements like St. Louis to put pressure on us. Potentially maybe even take the city of St. Louis, or making it painful enough that people would leave, because that's obviously controlling a portion of the Mississippi River now. And so that brings us to what I mentioned before, where Governor Clark wants to move influence from St. Louis upriver to where that bend is at Prairie du Chien. And like I said, that's one of the waterway connections between the Illinois River going through Chicago, and then the Wisconsin River coming through Prairie du Chien to the Mississippi River, and an important and vital trading resource, and like I said, just control of strategic waterway. So he establishes Fort Shelby. He establishes it June 2nd, 1814. So we're 2 years into the War of 1812 roughly, and just to orient you to the map here, Sakanak is the yellow dot in the middle. 5 is Credit Island, 8 is Campbell's Island, and so Fort Shelby is up there at the very northern portion here. And you can see the pencil sketch of what it looked like roughly to the left. So when Governor Clark comes up and establishes it, he does everything right. He's coming up the river with keel boats, and he's negotiating and talking to the Native Americans, saying, "Hey, we're here. We're your friends. We're going to be peaceful. We're just establishing this fort up here. No big deal. We're fighting the British, not you." And so he's doing it right. He's talking to the Native Americans. He's doing all this stuff. And we'll get a little bit more into that. The following battles take place a couple months later. The battle, the fall of Prairie du Chien and the fall of Fort Shelby, and then the Campbell's and Credit Island. So when Governor Clark goes up there, he takes 60 regular soldiers, which is a pretty sizable force being at this far out west, and then 140 60-day militia. So now, by the time he gets there, most of the militia's time is already used up. And so this is one of the considerations the commander has to say, well, okay, I've got these militia for 60 days. It takes me 50 days to get there. Well, they're going to want to go home now. They've got farms, fields to plow and stuff like that. And so he starts negotiating with them to try to get some of them to stay for a longer term at Fort Shelby. But they only agree to stay if they can sleep on the keel boats. They don't want to sleep in Fort Shelby. So they're really worried that's in a kind of a tenuous spot. And they, militia being militia, it's like, hey, if this gets really bad, we're going home. We're taking the boats and leaving. So Governor Clark leaves Lieutenant Perkins, a regular Army officer there, with the regulars and about 30 of the militia, and heads home. But the British on July 17th, so a little bit more than a month later, start an attack at Prairie du Chien at Fort Shelby, and initiate a siege of basically 3 days here. And one of the first shots of artillery that the British fired on the fort, the militia did exactly that. They cut their rope, said, "See you guys later. We're heading home." They started floating back down the river. So Lieutenant Perkins unfortunately surrenders 19th of July, and surrenders the garrison in what was built at Fort Shelby, and that's that. But the problem is, news travels so slowly here for the Americans that in between the time that Governor Clark leaves, gets back to St. Louis, he mounts a resupply expedition under the command of Lieutenant Campbell, who they're supposed to take 3 keel boats with a sutler. And a sutler is a civilian contractor that will basically negotiate and supply the fort. So the Army will give, the guns, the black powder, the uniforms, things like that. The sutler is a civilian trader that will have money and authorization to go out to the local community, and trade with people to get food for the soldiers in the fort. And so Lieutenant Campbell takes this expedition, consisting of 1st Infantry Regiment, regular soldiers, rangers, and then French boat contractors that are actually manning the boats and moving them. And to show you how slowly this goes, the keel boats actually have 2 railways or pathways down either side of the boat. And they're either paddling it upstream, or they're actually sticking a pole in the water, in the bottom of the water, and then walking the boat up. And so you're talking about maybe just a couple miles a day. Very excruciatingly slow process going upstream. Obviously downstream you can have a little bit better day, less work. But Lieutenant Campbell takes 133 men, women, and children. The sutler actually has his wife and son with him on the expedition as well, in the 3 keel boats. Now I want to go back to this map here. So Lieutenant Campbell does everything right, like Governor Clark does. As he's coming upstream, he's contacting the local Native Americans. He has scouts. As the boats are going up the river, he has scouts on either side of the river, talking to anybody they meet. And Lieutenant Campbell comes to the mouth of the Rock River, anchors his boats, and then goes into Sakanak and has a meeting with the tribal war chiefs, says, "Hey, we're your friends," same thing that Governor Clark does. And the Native Americans like, "Where's your medals? We want black powder." Okay, you go kill British and we will give you black powder. Whereas the British response to this is like, "Here, have black powder, go kill Americans." And so which one's more appealing? It's the British approach here. And so as they're having their meeting, Lieutenant Campbell, some of his officers, and the tribal chiefs of the Sakanak or Sauk tribe, including Blackhawk, news arrives from Prairie du Chien that Fort Shelby is falling. But the Native Americans are getting the information, not the Americans. And as they're having this, it's basically a big party, that's going on. The French boatmen are there, and some of the Native Americans come up to the French boatmen that are manning the American boats and say, "Hey, you may want to hightail it out of here. Next couple of days ain't going to be so pretty for you. So we're just giving you a forewarning." And as Lieutenant Campbell comes back to his boats, the French boatmen tell him, "Hey, they're telling us that they're going to attack us in the next couple of days." And Lieutenant Campbell, no, they assured me they were peaceful, so don't worry about it. And so the next day, Campbell gets back in his boats and heads upriver, past Arsenal Island through the rapids. And they were having trouble navigating the very last boat that Lieutenant Campbell was on. It was the boat that was loaded down with all the supplies for the sutler. And they talked about at a couple points through the rapids, they were actually stopping the boats, anchoring next to each other, and unloading supplies from the sutler's boat into the other boats to lighten it enough to get through the rapids. And as they pass Arsenal Island, the two boats in the lead continue on up the stream, and Lieutenant Campbell's boat still lagging behind. So there's quite a distance between them. And as you know, living here for any period of time in the summer, we can get those storms that blow in that are pretty fierce, really heavy rain, good wind. And as Lieutenant Campbell gets up to a previously unnamed island, a strong wind gust pushes his boat into the island and beaches the boat on the island. And again, Lieutenant Campbell does everything right. He sends scouts out to protect his perimeter out onto the island. The problem is that Blackhawk, taking loyal Native Americans that are not in favor of the Americans and want their land back, and they've been traveling and following them all the way up the river. Well, this is actually a picture of Campbell's Island, the present day named Campbell's Island, and what it looked like in 1904. And so you can see the kind of beach or sandy beach here. There was an ice shelf here, but you can see how heavily wooded it was. So imagine having your boat get beached on this island, and you send out scouts into the in the thicket here, and now you're trying to get your boat stuck off the island. Well, during the storm, and while they're trying to do this, Blackhawk attacks with an unknown number of Native Americans, kills the sentries that were put out by Campbell, and the fighting gets so fierce that the Native Americans are actually on the boat with the little portholes that are in the side of the armored, so heavily wooded sides of the ship, and they're sticking spears and hoes actually through the portholes trying to get the Americans inside. And so with this, Lieutenant Campbell was basically by himself on his boat. Gunfire is going back and forth. There's smoke coming up from the gunfire, and the other two boats hear the gunfire going on. And so they circle back around, and they come down and try to give assistance to Lieutenant Campbell. And there's always been talk about, whether contractors will follow soldiers into combat. Well, the French boatmen that had been warned the night before that there was going to be an attack, as the other two boats that came back, as they get close to Campbell's boat, they're the first ones to jump off the boat into the river, pulling the other boats up alongside Lieutenant Campbell's boat, which is now, by the way, on fire, because Native Americans are setting the boat on fire and are using flaming arrows. And so they're the ones that are pulling off, along with the soldiers, they're pulling off the wounded off Campbell's boat, including Lieutenant Campbell, who was mortally wounded at this time, and putting them on the other boats and starting to, evacuate some of the supplies and stuff. After they do this, in about a 30-minute firefight between the Americans and the Native Americans, the boats peel off and start floating in downstream. Ironically, about the same time, the militia that had left Fort Shelby now start floating downstream and meet up with the other two American boats. And they ended up anchoring together and finding out that, well, Fort Shelby's fallen. We fought valiantly to try to save Fort Shelby, but it just couldn't be saved, so we left. And so they got, the bad news, and the other officers that were on in Lieutenant Campbell's expedition decided, well, discretion is the better part of valor. We should go home and tell Governor Clark about this and regroup. And so they retreat downstream and head back to St. Louis. Well, about this time, then Lieutenant Campbell gets back, and he dies shortly after he gets back in St. Louis. And they give the report, about what happened. An up-and-coming officer gets to St. Louis, American officer, I should say, by the name of Major Zachary Taylor. And he would become later on President Zachary Taylor after this. Governor Clark decides, well, hey, we need to go back up, decide or figure out what's going on, see if we can reestablish Fort Shelby, and basically have a revenge expedition. And so Major Taylor sets a group of boats together, 8 keel boats, and gets regular soldiers, rangers together, and decides that they're going to go back upstream to attack the village of Sakanak. And his initial plans were to actually come up and come right straight down the Rock River with artillery that's on the ships and shell the village of Sakanak. And he said, he basically had this idea that I'm going to be all sneaky like. I'm going to get up there, I'm going to attack them in the middle of the night. They're not going to know what hit them, basically. Well, unfortunately for Major Taylor, the Native Americans knew exactly when he left St. Louis. They were following the entire way up. So he changes his plan as he starts seeing Native Americans along the way, that he's going to come up past the Arsenal Island today, somewhere about Moline or East Moline, come on by land, take his artillery pieces that he has, come by land over and attack the back of the Sakanak village from the land side. That's even a more, ambitious plan. For one, you're hoping the Native Americans think that you're going up the prairie machine. Two, now you're going over their land, their territory that they know the best, and basically being blind at doing it. He's changing his plan on the go here and not developing very good plans here. Now, while I said that Lieutenant Campbell did everything right, he has scouts and everything out, Major Taylor does everything basically wrong here. He doesn't put scouts out. He's coming in like a sledgehammer. I'm just going to pound them. I'm going to use my cannons, be cool stuff, blowing stuff up. He doesn't really put a lot of thought into this, and just is coming up here for this revenge expedition. So, and I wanted to show you here, these are what the longboats look like. Somewhere between 60 and 80 feet in length. They have a little cabin in the back that's armored, and just that it's thicker wood so that musket balls can't go through it. And then they have a sail, which will help you at times. And then also most are armed with a swivel gun, which is basically just a small cannon on a swivel that was really intended to shoot like shrapnel, little cannon or little tiny like musket balls out of it, make it into a shotgun or whatever you could find, nails, rocks, just shove it down the barrel and fire. And so each of these 8 boats have a swivel gun on them. He also has a 6-pound cannon, so it's firing a 6-pound cannonball projectile, and then he has a 3-pound gun with him as well. So let me go back to the map here. They get to the mouth of the Rock River on the 4th of September. And again, like I said, his plan keeps changing. And he's going to go with plan B, up here to try to, flank him and do this cool maneuver going all the way around. Well, he gets to basically the mouth of the rapids right here at Arsenal Island. And the exact same thing that happened to Lieutenant Campbell happens to Major Taylor. Storm blows in, start blowing all the boats around. And well, I said he didn't do anything right here, or he wasn't doing a lot of stuff that was right. Well, before you leave on an expedition, you make sure you have all your gear, right? Well, some of the boats didn't have their anchors. And most of the time when, you're going to anchor for the night, you don't anchor to the shore because somebody can get you, right? You anchor in the middle of the river. So you have a little berth around you where people can't get to it. Well, some of his boats don't have anchors. And so what does he do? He gets blown back downstream and anchored on Willow Island, which is directly next to Campbell's Island. And since they don't have anchors, they actually tie their boats right straight to the island itself. What's that? Oh, I'm sorry. Credit Island. And it's actually Willow's Island, which is directly next to Credit Island. I apologize for that. And he has 330 soldiers in total. Now, this is actually obviously it's 1920s aerial view of it, but this is Willow Island and then Credit Island here in total. This area where you can actually drive to Credit Island exists today, but it didn't exist at the time of the battle. So he's lined up here on Willow Island, and I want to show you a shot here. That's showing what the original island looked like. And then keep in mind, this black box, that's the effective musket range. So that's how far you can accurately hit something. And so if you're at the western side of the island, of Willow Island, you can't hit a soldier accurately or a Native American accurately on Credit Island. But so this, Davenport's to the north. This is Rock Island here, Willow Island, and the Credit Island. And so his boats, all 8 of them, are lined up in a nice neat row right on Willow Island. The storm is so bad, they says nobody's going to be moving tonight. Native Americans aren't going to find me. I'll be fine. He doesn't even put out sentries onto Willow Island. Now, at the same time, since, like I said, Native Americans knew exactly what Major Taylor was doing, the forces that had attacked at Fort Shelby and taken Fort Shelby, they had artillery with them. they had one regular artillery or regular army British artillery non-commissioned officer, so a sergeant, and he brings a 6-pound cannon with him, and he brings 2 1-pound cannons. I'm sorry, 2 3-pound cannons with him too, and he brings them down in the thought that he's going to come to Sakanak and help the Native Americans defend against the Americans coming up. Well, he gets to basically the Sakanak area, meets up with Blackhawk, and decides, well, hey, we know Major Taylor's in the area. We're going to put our guns onto present-day Arsenal Island and shell his boats as they come past the island to the rapids. It'll be a great spot. Well, after Major Taylor hits the storm and he comes back down to Willow Island here, the plan changes. And so, wait, go back one here. Arsenal Island's to the east. So this British artillery NCO comes down, and he's coming down the banks of the Mississippi River, and he sees, maybe really early in the morning, he sees Major Taylor's boats lined up perfectly along the shore of the Willow Island. And so they set their gun position up here on the banks of the Mississippi River, right by Davenport. And the red is everything that he could hit. So the blue area here is the shadow that's caused by the island, so things that you can't see. And so all Major Taylor's boats are in the red in perfect firing position. And now imagine all 8 of these 60 to 80-foot boats lined up in a nice deep line, and you're firing straight down the sides of them. So if you miss one, there's a good chance you're going to hit one of the other 7 behind it. And so it's kind of like shooting fish in a barrel at this point. And so what happens, the artillery position set up, Native Americans work their way onto Willow Island. And as the story goes, one of the American soldiers gets off the boat, gets onto Willow Island to go and do his morning constitutional, and gets shot, takes a round right in the forehead. The battle starts. So Major Taylor sends his guys off the boat. They start sweeping the Native Americans off the island. Native Americans, wade from Willow Island over to Credit Island. As the American forces get to the very western bank of Willow Island, and in the descriptions of the writings of Major Taylor and the other soldiers, they see this mass of humanity. Thousands of Native Americans over on Credit Island, all screaming with their guns and bows and arrows and everything like that. In reality, Blackhawk says it's somewhere between 600 and 800 Native Americans that are in the area. In Major Taylor's reports, somewhere about 12 to 1,500 Native Americans. There's a battery of British artillery. There's a whole company of British regular soldiers. So, it needs to pump it up a little bit. So, if you have to lose a battle, you got to make it sound good, right? And so as they're getting to the very western tip of the island, the Americans, Major Taylor sends one of his boats down to start shelling this mass of Native Americans on Credit Island. As the boat, commanded by Lieutenant Rector, gets down to about here, all of a sudden Major Taylor is just floored by artillery fire that's coming from his right side from the present day area of Davenport. And it's just super accurate. It's pounding his boats. It's pumping holes all through his boats. And it's just shot after shot after shot. And he decides, okay, I'll offload one of my artillery pieces, my 6-pound gun. And the artillery fire is coming in so heavy against his boats. He said, no, keep the gun on the ship. We got to go. And so they start breaking their anchor. They're leaving so fast, they're actually cutting the ropes. They're not even untying themselves off the shore. They're cutting their ropes and drifting downstream to try to get away from the artillery fire. Now it's described by the British artillery sergeant that he fired 63 shots, only missing 3 times in the course of about, we think, 45 minutes. And so can you imagine the rain of fire from these 3 guns just pounding, Major Taylor's ship? And then all of a sudden, he has that in the back of his mind that artillery fire is coming in. I've got a ton of Native Americans over here. There ain't going to win. I'm going to win this battle. And so he decides to do the best thing here, a tactical withdrawal, and take in what's going on. And so he floats back down the stream, and the British artillery non-commissioned officer is so motivated that he wants to end this battle. He wants to sink these boats. That he actually brings his gun and starts following down the shore to cross over onto Credit Island with the hope to try to start shelling the American boats as they're going downstream. He's that motivated to get these ships. Major Taylor floats downstream fast enough that that doesn't happen. At least it's not described that he gets any more shots on. But they pull the boats together in the middle of the river, somewhere downstream out of the range of fire, and they hold what's called a council of officers. So they bring all the officers together to consider their options here, and they all agree that, yeah, maybe we should go back to St. Louis and tell Governor Clark what happened here, and kind of weigh our options. So Major Taylor describes this battle for the rest of his life as the only loss that he ever had in his military career. And one of the unique things about this is that this battle at Campbell's Island and then at Credit Island is actually publicized first in St. Louis, and then it gets to all of the East Coast newspapers, naming Major Taylor, Lieutenant Campbell by name. Talking about this great battle, thousands of Native Americans attacked ambushed these poor American soldiers. But it's one of these things that he starts really getting his name known and getting publicized in the East Coast newspapers. Now, in the rest of the War of 1812 and time after, he's slowly rising up to the ranks, eventually becoming general. But this is one of those first occasions where he starts getting name recognition in East Coast newspapers. So, unfortunately for the Americans here in this case, after Major Taylor gets back to St. Louis, there's never another expedition that's mounted and come up, reestablish Fort Shelby. So the whole upper Mississippi River Valley region, basically everything north of St. Louis, is largely abandoned. Americans never try to do anything else. The British, do harassing attacks back down the river against any American targets of opportunity with their Native American allies, but really nothing else happens dramatic at this point. And so these two battles become the furthest west battles of the War of 1812, fought right here in our backyard in the Quad Cities. And so the aftermath, like I said here, is that we abandon this region. Blackhawk believes he's won the war here, and that the Americans have abandoned the region and have abandoned the treaty. But what happens, and one of the reasons why he's so well known is not necessarily for these battles, but the later on the later on Blackhawk War in 1832, where Blackhawk takes what was known as his British band. So, an amalgamation of all these Native Americans that believed that the British were going to save them and that they could regain their land. They band together and start heading north to try to link up with the British in Canada, where Blackhawk eventually meets up against American militia and regular forces near Sauk City, just kind of southwest of Sauk City in Wisconsin, present-day Wisconsin, and holds off the Americans for a little bit, but ends up getting most of his followers getting massacred at the Battle of Bad Axe along the river just west of there. Then Blackhawk gets captured by the Americans. And one of the ironies of this, and like I mentioned to you before about all these different people that are well known today, the two officers that captured him were Robert Anderson, who would go on to lead the American garrison at Fort Sumter, and Jefferson Davis, who would go on to become the Confederate president of the Confederacy, who were both Army officers at the time. And they were the ones who were charged with taking Blackhawk back to the East Coast. So, links later on in history, but because of the battles of Credit and Campbell's Island, in 1816, following the conclusion of the War of 1812, the United States Army sets up a fort at Arsenal Island, which becomes Fort Armstrong. And it's at the very western tip of the island, again, because they saw the strategic importance of having a federal presence in the area, of controlling the river traffic going through the area at the Rockhound Rapids. And at that time, when they established it, to keep an eye on Blackhawk and this band that had attacked us during the War of 1812 as well, and trying to put a check on British influence. But that's an etching of what the Arsenal Island looking at towards Rock Island in the distance, present day Rock Island. So these battles in memory, like I said, we have a really unique opportunity that we live near these areas, and this is one of the staff rides where we take soldiers here. At Campbell's Island, there's actually on the north side of the island, there's a ring road that goes all around the island. You can actually go to, there's a really nice little park that has that monument on, and it has an incredibly accurate depiction of the battle here. And so, because it's kind of hard to see, these are the trees that on Campbell's Island. This is Lieutenant Campbell's boat. This is the second boat that came up, pulled up next to them. The American soldiers are firing onto the Native Americans while the French boatmen are actually pulling the wounded Lieutenant Campbell in the picture off of his boat onto the other boats before their evacuation. And so it's a nice park you can walk around. And one of the interesting things about that is that we know roughly in that spot within a reasonable amount of air that is exactly where the battle took place, because Lieutenant Campbell's boat stays there for about the next 75 years. The charred hulk of his boat stays there for the next 75 years. And one of the reasons why that becomes Campbell's Island. And one of the reasons as an Army officer why you don't want to have an island named after you if you're lost here. Now, Major Taylor wasn't so lucky in getting the island named after him, but Credit Island, as you come onto the island, almost immediately to the right side, you'll see there's an old golf house or golf building there. And there's a large rock here that has a memorial that was dedicated a few years ago on the 200th anniversary of the battle. And that's, like I said, in between the spot where the Native Americans were and the Americans were on Willow Island. So you can actually go out and walk to these locations and walk in the footsteps of Major Taylor and Blackhawk in these locations. So it's kind of a neat bringing history back to present day.